1945. The Allied armies had decisively crushed the German war machine that had wreaked havoc throughout Europe. In defeating the German occupiers on the Eastern Front, the Russians liberated Poland and other Eastern European countries from Nazi occupation. But unlike Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, freedoms won one day were gone the next as Soviet communist rule replaced Nazi rule. Hardly a word could be uttered without being overheard by the secret police. Limitations on print and political dissent were imposed. In Poland, the entire constitution was rewritten to conform to the communist system, and Poland became a Soviet puppet state. Over the ensuing decades, rising food prices and falling wages resulted in worker dissatisfaction that culminated with nationwide strikes. It is at this time that a labor union called Solidarity and an electrician named Lech Walesa started a movement that would revolutionize Poland and all of Eastern Europe. The first stirrings of revolution took place on a cold December morning in 1970. Reacting to massive increases in the prices of basic food items, several thousand workers in the Lenin shipyards of Gdansk took to the streets in protest. Mark Kablonsky, now a citizen of the United States, was a boy living near Gdansk at the time.
Solidarity began as a workers' movement, and it turned into some kind of political party for people fighting with the communist system, which was existing in Poland at the time. And the workers found only one way to do it, is by proclaiming a general strike. So they went to the shipyard in Gdansk, and they start occupying the shipyard out there.
Within days, the unrest had spread across northern Poland, but the protesters made the mistake of becoming a mob, setting fire to a town hall and looting market stores. The brutal secret police was called in to subdue the unruly mob. A few hours later, the workers had been subdued. Nearly 80 people had been shot or beaten to death. The revolt had been ruthlessly put down. Many years later, on August 14th, 1980, Lech Walesa, a veteran of the 1970 Gdansk protest, arrived at the shipyards to demand the government both respect workers' rights and allow a monument to the martyrs of 1970. Government rejection sent Walesa underground, working with others to print 30,000 copies of a new sheet spreading the message of reform. They called the publication Solidarność, or Solidarity. As with most revolutions, the reforms set in motion by Solidarity did not occur in isolation. One outside influence was native son Pope John Paul, who, in 1979, a year before Walesa issued his demands at the shipyard, celebrated a mass in Poland, watched or attended by millions of Poles. The inability of the communist government to prevent the appearance of John Paul was not lost on the Polish people. For perhaps the first time they sensed the power of organized effort. Mark Kablonsky, recalling the visit of the Pope, observes that
at that time, John Paul was Pope, so his influence and the news about the workers' movement in Poland, it hit the front pages of every newspaper around the world. The influence of John Paul II was such that it was impossible at that time just to kill everyone and just try to cover it up. If there wouldn't be for the Pope, definitely, that would be one of the avenues that they could have used in these circumstances.
This connection between the reform-minded shipyard workers and the Catholic Church was manifested 2 days after Walesa made his demands in 1980. Drawn by the Solidarity newsletter, delegations from other strike committees arrived at the shipyard, where Catholic priest Henryk Jalkowski performed a mass. At this gathering, additional demands were made on the government relating to quality of life issues and the right to organize. Again, the government said no. But by September 3rd, 1980, the reform movement had ignited the passions of freedom in Poland. Hundreds of mines, factories, and other shipyards united with the workers at Gdansk. The workers held out until the government finally agreed to extend unprecedented freedoms to organize independent labor unions and participate in some aspects of government. On September 17th, Solidarity was officially formed and Lech Walesa was elected its president. Despite this notable victory, freedom for Poland was still far from secure.
Poland was under the domination of Soviet Union. It was in the Soviet bloc. So everything what was going on in Poland was with the agreement of that what Moscow allowed to happen in Poland.
Aware that a single tear in the communist fabric of Poland could rend the entire cloak of the communist Eastern Bloc, the Soviets acted without delay. First, they replaced the Polish First Secretary with an iron-fisted crony. Next, they began to mass tanks and troops on the border, preparing to invade. This time, however, another external influence enabled the fledgling Solidarity movement to survive. Whereas outgoing U.S. President Jimmy Carter had sent a weak message threatening to denounce the Soviets, incoming President Ronald Reagan sent a new message. If you roll into Poland, we will arm China. This ultimately persuaded the Soviets to stand down. With the imminent threat of a Soviet invasion diminished, the Solidarity movement limped along as martial law was declared throughout Poland in early December 1981. Mark Jablonski was 18 years old at the time.
There was a period of time when the government imposed the martial law in order to take control of the country. And at that time, we were not able to walk outside of our houses after 10 p.m. We lost pretty much all of our freedoms, any kind of freedom that we were hoping for, and that any kind of opposition would be fought with force from the side of the government.
Pressured by the Soviets, the newly repressive Polish government clamped down once again on the press, outlawed public assemblies, and arrested Solidarity's leaders, including Lech Walesa. Military forces appeared on the streets to enforce the 10 o'clock p.m. curfew. Solidarity was outlawed. Although Walesa was released 11 months later and martial law was lifted in 1983, arrests and harassments of those suspected of Solidarity connections continued. While deadly force was occasionally used, it was the government assassination of a popular pro-Solidarity priest, Jerzy Popluszko, that sparked a new demand for revolution. Thousands of Poles poured into the streets, reacting to the murder with demands for justice and reform. Again, external events opened a window of opportunity. Mikhail Gorbachev became the Soviet General Secretary. Responding to the realities of a failing economy and to international pressure, Gorbachev relaxed the Soviets' grip on the Eastern Bloc, and on September 30th, 1986, Lech Walesa was once again allowed to legally organize Solidarity. By December 1990, the calls for reforms that had begun in the Lenin shipyards of Gdansk 20 years earlier blossomed into a revolution that carried Lech Walesa to the presidency of a newly independent Poland. The little tear in the fabric of Polish socialism eventually led to the complete disintegration of the Soviet Empire. History's revolutions and reforms are typically won only after hard-fought battles, loss of life, and a combination of forces, within the country and without. The courage and determination of the Polish people, Lech Walesa, and the Solidarity movement liberated Poland and reformed the world. As Mark Jablonski sums it up,
that it was the greatest freedom movement in Europe at that time, and from the Solidarity movement everything started, or it happened at many people's expenses, because many people lost their lives and their livelihood, and so it was a great thing, but at a very high price.